He announced it like a verdict. Not a confession, not an apology. A verdict, delivered in front of 40 witnesses over crystal glasses and untouched plates, in a room where everyone understood exactly what was happening and no one moved a muscle to stop it. Kang Tae-jun stood at the head of his own dining table, his arm wrapped around a woman in deep burgundy, and told her, that this was the woman he loved. His wife was still wearing her coat, still had rain on her shoulders. She had come straight from a meeting. She had texted him she was on her way. And he had timed it. He had timed it. If you were standing in that room, if that were your coat, your ring, your name being casually demolished in front of the people who were supposed to respect you, what would you do? Would you scream? Would you cry? Would you beg him to stop? Or would you do what Imani Caldwell Kong did, which was something no one in that room, including her husband, ever expected? This is her story. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. Because we release stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what happens next, what Imani does in the silence after that night, is going to stay with you. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind of slow, relentless Seattle rain that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and refuses to leave. By the time Imani's car turned onto the private road leading to the estate, the lake behind the property had disappeared into low gray mist, and the house itself blazed with light the way it only did when Tae-jun wanted people to see it from the water. She noticed the cars first, too many of them. A row of black SUVs, 2 town cars with out-of-state plates, her husband's personal driver standing near the service entrance with that particular stillness he adopted when he'd been instructed to be invisible. Her phone had 3 unread messages from Naomi Whitaker, her attorney, and one of the few people she trusted without conditions. She hadn't opened them. She'd been in back-to-back development meetings since 7 that morning, her 3rd consecutive 14-hour day, and the plan had been simple. Come home, change clothes, appear beside her husband long enough to satisfy whatever political obligation was unfolding inside, then get 8 hours of sleep before the East Side zoning presentation at 6 the following morning. That had been the plan. Imani stepped out of the car and adjusted her coat. The rain hit immediately, fine and cold, settling into the fabric of her shoulders. She thanked her driver without looking at him, the way you do when your mind is already 3 steps ahead of your body. And she walked toward the main entrance with the focused, unhurried stride that everyone who worked with her recognized. It was the walk of a woman who had trained herself never to look uncertain, even when she was. The entrance hall was quiet, the sound of voices, laughter, the particular elevated hum of a room full of people who believed themselves important. It drifted through the corridor from the dining room. She could hear Tae-jun's voice somewhere inside it, low and controlled, doing what he did in rooms like this, which was performing ease so precisely that people mistook it for genuine comfort. She had watched him do it for 17 years. She almost turned toward the staircase, almost chose to go upstairs, change, take 5 minutes to become the version of herself this room would require. But something stopped her, some flicker of instinct she couldn't name, and instead she pushed through the dining room doors and walked in. The conversation didn't stop immediately. Rooms that large take a moment to register a new presence, the way a body of water takes a beat to respond to a stone. She saw the nearest faces turn first. A city council member she'd worked with on the Pioneer Square restoration, a banking executive whose wife played tennis with her mother, a woman in a green dress she didn't recognize. And then the ripple moved inward, and the sound in the room dropped, and Imani understood, with the particular clarity that arrives before conscious thought, that something was wrong. Tae-jun was standing at the head of the table. He was not alone. The woman beside him was perhaps 30, possibly younger, with the kind of deliberate elegance that takes hours to construct and is designed to look effortless. She was wearing deep burgundy, the exact shade Imani had worn to the Harbor Foundation Gala 3 months earlier, the photographs of which had circulated through Seattle's social press for 2 weeks. The dress wasn't accidental, neither was the positioning. She was standing precisely where a wife would stand. Tae-jun's arm was around her. His expression, when his eyes found Imani across the silent room, was not surprise. It was not guilt. It was not the fleeting panic of a man caught doing something he'd tried to hide. It was calculation, clean and deliberate as a signature. He had been waiting for her to walk in. Imani. Her name in his mouth was calm, almost pleasant. "You're here earlier than I expected." He paused for exactly the right number of seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to understand the mechanics of what was happening, not long enough to let her respond. "I want everyone to meet Yuna. She's been important to me for some time now." His hand settled more firmly at Yuna's waist. "She's the woman I love." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Imani did not move. She was aware, in that suspended moment, of 40 faces turned toward her, some horrified, some carefully neutral, 2 or 3 with expressions she would later identify as anticipatory, people who had known or suspected and had come tonight because they wanted to see the moment unfold. She was aware of the chandelier overhead, the untouched courses on the table, the rain still damp on her coat. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had not increased. That surprised her. She had expected to feel something violent. Rage, maybe. Or the particular chest-collapsing grief that arrives when something you chose to believe turns out to have been wrong from the start. She had spent 16 years convincing herself that whatever Taijun was underneath the things she knew about him, he possessed some irreducible minimum of respect for her, not love. She had stopped expecting that years ago, and had quietly mourned its absence in private, in the way that married people do when they realize the distance has become permanent, but they have not yet decided what to do about it. But respect. The basic acknowledgement that she was a person standing in the same room as him, not furniture he had arranged to his preference. It turned out that had also been wrong. What she felt instead of rage was something quieter and more decisive. The sensation of a door closing, not slamming, closing, with the soft, final click of a mechanism that works exactly as it was built to work. She reached up with her right hand and removed her wedding ring. Her fingers were steady. She noticed that and filed it away. She walked across the room. 40 people watched her cross the floor in wet-shouldered silence and stopped beside Taejun's place at the head of the table. She set the ring down on the white linen beside his whiskey glass. It made almost no sound. She looked at him once. Not long. Not with any particular expression she was manufacturing for the audience. Just looked at him the way you look at something when you are confirming what it actually is. Then she turned and walked back toward the doors. She heard his laugh before she reached them. It was the laugh he used in rooms like this. Rich, slightly theatrical, designed to communicate that what had just happened was minor, that it was already over, that the room should relax because the man in charge found it mildly amusing. The doors closed behind her. In the corridor, the sound disappeared. Her driver was still at the end of the hall. She walked past him and out into the rain. She got into the back seat. The door shut. The car didn't move. She sat in the dark for approximately 90 seconds. Then she took out her phone, opened the unread messages from Naomi. All 3 of them were variations of "call me when you can. It's not urgent, but I have some things for you to review," and typed 4 words in reply. "Start the process tomorrow." She put the phone face down in her lap. Outside, rain moved across the windows in long, irregular sheets. The light from the house fell across the wet driveway in broken gold. Imani Caldwell Kong sat in the back seat of her car outside her husband's dinner party and felt, with a steadiness that both surprised and did not surprise her, that she was ready. She had not been ready 2 years ago, when she first understood the shape of what her marriage had become. She had not been ready a year ago, when she'd quietly asked Naomi to outline the legal framework without filing anything. She had not been ready 6 months ago, when she'd moved significant portions of her professional documentation and financial records to a Caldwell trust structure that her father had built with precisely this contingency in mind, because Malcolm Caldwell had not trusted Taijun from the beginning and had loved his daughter too carefully to leave her unprotected. But she was ready now. Taejun had decided to make it clean and public and humiliating, and that decision, which he believed was his greatest leverage, was in fact the thing that freed her. Because you cannot appeal to the dignity of someone you've destroyed in front of 40 witnesses. You cannot ask for patience or understanding or private negotiation from a woman you've already dismissed publicly as irrelevant. Whatever hold he might have had over her through confusion or guilt or the complicated loyalty of shared years, he had burned it himself in a room full of people, with his arm around a woman in a borrowed dress. She asked her driver to take her to her other property, the apartment in Capitol Hill that she maintained separately, and that Taejun had never particularly questioned because he had always found her real estate habits excessive and mildly dull. He had found most of her work mildly dull, actually. That had been among the first signs, though she had not read it correctly until much later. The apartment was quiet and smelled of the particular clean emptiness of a space that is maintained but not often inhabited. She poured herself a glass of water, not wine, because she wanted her head clear, and she sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and began going through documents she had reviewed many times before, but which now had a different status. Her attorney would file in the morning. By the time Tae-jun finished his dinner party and the last guest drove away from the waterfront estate, Imani Caldwell would have reviewed every financial structure, every property holding, every trust arrangement, every corporate document relevant to the dissolution of her marriage. Not because she was uncertain about the path forward, because she was the kind of woman who, when she committed to something, did it completely. What she did not think about that night, what she actively chose not to spend time on, was Yuna Park. Yuna was not the point. Imani understood this with a clarity that had taken years to develop. The woman in the burgundy dress was not a villain in Imani's story. She was a symptom. A choice Tae-jun had made because he believed his world was permanent enough to afford that kind of recklessness, because he had mistaken the stability around him for his own creation. That was the misunderstanding that would cost him everything. But Imani did not know yet exactly how completely it would cost him. She knew what she was protected from. Her father had made sure of that. She knew her businesses were clean and separate and untouchable. She knew the waterfront estate carried debt structures tied to Caldwell, holding companies that most people in Tae-jun's organization had never been told about, because Tae-jun had been too proud to examine the details of arrangements that benefited him. She knew that she had spent 17 years standing beside a man who needed her presence more than he had ever understood, and that she had allowed it because she had genuinely believed, that somewhere underneath the empire and the performance and the controlled violence of how he moved through the world, he recognized what she actually was. The ring on the dining room table was the answer to that question. She closed her laptop at 2 in the morning and went to sleep in the clean, quiet apartment that Tae-jun had always considered a minor extravagance. She slept better than she had in years. Across Seattle, the dinner party had long since ended. Tae-jun sat alone in the dining room with the last of his whiskey, the staff having cleared everything except the glass and the small circle of lamplight around his chair. Yuna had gone upstairs. The guests were gone. The house was his again, which was how he preferred it. He reached toward the table, some instinct, some gesture he had performed thousands of times, and his fingers found the wedding ring. He hadn't seen Imani set it down. He'd been performing for the room. By the time he looked, she was already at the doors. He turned the ring in his fingers once. It was a simple band, white gold, the kind Imani had specifically requested when they were married because she found elaborate settings impractical. He had teased her for that choice. She had not adjusted her preference. He set it back on the linen. He was not concerned. He had expected this. He had expected the lawyer, the filing, the formal process of separation. He had expected her to be angry. He had prepared for anger, had prepared, in fact, for a version of this that involved significantly more screaming, more doors slamming, more of the emotional collateral that accompanied the end of a marriage. What he had not expected was the walk across the room, the complete silence, the ring placed with that specific quietness, not thrown, not dramatic, just set down the way you set down something that no longer belongs to you. He had not expected the way she looked at him before she turned. It had not been hatred, that he could have read and processed and filed under familiar categories. It had been something he didn't have an easy name for, the expression of a person who has just confirmed something they had already, privately, accepted. He finished his whiskey. He was not concerned, he told himself again. By morning, he would almost believe it. The morning after the dinner party, Tae-jun woke at 6:15 the way he always did. Not from an alarm, but from whatever internal mechanism had replaced sleep with vigilance sometime in his early 30s. He lay still for approximately 40 seconds, which was his habit, running through the day's architecture before his feet touched the floor. Yuna was still asleep beside him. He could hear her breathing, slow and even, one arm stretched across the space Imani had occupied for 16 years. He did not look at her. He got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the lake. The rain had stopped. The water was flat and gray-green, the color of old glass, and across it the morning light was doing something pale and unconvincing. He watched a boat move along the far shore, unhurried, trailing a thin white line behind it. His phone showed 14 messages and 3 missed calls, all from within the last 2 hours. He read none of them. He went to the bathroom, showered, dressed in the particular deliberate sequence he had followed since his 20s, undershirt, then dress shirt, collar first, each button from the bottom, and walked downstairs to the kitchen where his housekeeper had already set coffee on the counter. He drank it standing up. At 7:40, his lead attorney, Park Sungjin, called for the second time, and this time Tae-jun answered. She filed, Sungjin said, no preamble. Tae-jun set down his cup. When? First thing this morning, Naomi Whitaker's office. I have the preliminary paperwork. Send it. There's something you should know before you read it. Sungjin paused, and Tae-jun recognized the pause. It was the pause of a man who has found something and is making a decision about how to deliver it. The asset structure is different from what we assumed, significantly different. Define significantly. Another pause, shorter but harder. The estate, Tae-jun. The waterfront property. It's financed through a Caldwell holding entity. A trust structure Malcolm set up before he died. We are looking at the documents now, and the language is, it's very clean, very deliberate. We didn't catch it because the mortgage paperwork we saw during the marriage was a summary document, not the underlying agreement. Tae-jun was quiet. Tae-jun, I heard you. There's more. I need you to come in today, not tomorrow, today. He hung up without answering and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the empty coffee cup in his hand, looking at the counter, at the grain of the stone, at absolutely nothing. Then he set the cup down very carefully and went to get his coat. He had not been worried the night before. He was beginning to reconsider that position. Sungjin's office was in a high-rise in downtown Seattle, the kind of building that existed to communicate seriousness through its architecture. Glass and clean lines and a lobby that made you feel, regardless of what you'd walked in carrying, that whatever happened here was measured and professional and unlikely to result in anything you couldn't survive. Tae-jun had chosen the firm partly because of the building. He had always understood that a certain kind of legitimacy was rented as much as earned. Sungjin met him at the elevator. He was 61, Korean-born, educated in Seoul and then Stanford, with the compact, contained energy of a man who had spent 4 decades managing problems other people had created. He was not easy to rattle. He was visibly rattled now. They sat in the conference room. Sungjin spread documents across the table. Walk me through it, Tae-jun said. The Caldwell Family Trust holds the underlying mortgage on the Lake Washington property. Not a bank. The trust. Which means the repayment structure is internal to Imani's estate, not external. Sungjin's finger moved along the document. When the marriage dissolves, the trust has the right to call the balance of the note, in full. How much? 4.3 million. Tae-jun said nothing. That's the estate. But the larger issue. Sungjin gathered the papers and moved to a second set. The Caldwell Urban Renewal operating accounts. We listed those as marital business assets in our preliminary assessment. They're her company. They've always been her company. Yes, but we assumed there would be some argument for commingling, shared revenue streams, marital contributions. Make the argument. Sungjin looked at him with the specific patience of a man who has already made and discarded the argument 3 times before his client arrived. There's nothing to commingle. Malcolm Caldwell structured those entities in 2009, 4 years into your marriage, and every financial document since then maintains a complete and documented separation between Caldwell business revenue and Kang household finances. Her salary was paid from the Caldwell accounts to a personal account in her name only. The household expenses you shared came from a joint account that she funded from personal draws, not business draws, every transaction, for 15 years. Tae-jun's jaw moved. She did this on purpose. It was not a question. Sungjin treated it like one anyway. Her father did it first. She maintained it. He paused. It's not illegal. It's not even unusual for high net worth family trusts. It's just thorough. Malcolm never trusted me. No, Sungjin said. He didn't. Tae-jun stood up and walked to the window. 42 floors down, the street was small and busy and indifferent. People moving along wet sidewalks with the focused purposelessness of morning commuters. He watched them for a moment. What do I actually own? He said. Sungjin was quiet for 4 seconds. Tae-jun counted them. The syndicate operations are separate from this conversation. I know they're separate. I'm asking about the legitimate side. The 2 restaurants, the import-export entity in Bellevue, the vehicle fleet. Sungjin's voice was even. "And the cash holdings in the accounts we haven't yet mapped against the trust structure. That's it. The waterfront property will revert when the note is called. The Capitol Hill apartment in her name, that's hers. The Lake Chelan investment property was purchased through a Caldwell subtrust in 2018. That's hers." He paused. "The condo in Vancouver was purchased jointly, that we can contest." Taejun turned from the window. His face was composed in the way it became when he was absorbing something that his body wanted to respond to violently and his mind was overriding. The people in his organization had learned to read that expression like a barometric drop, a signal that something dangerous was building at a pressure not yet visible on the surface. "She structured all of this years ago," Taejun said. "Yes. And I didn't know. No. Because I never looked." Sungjin said nothing. "Because I didn't think I needed to look." The sentence sat in this conference room between them. Sungjin had the professional integrity not to agree out loud, which Taejun noted and filed. He collected his coat from the back of the chair. "Find everything," he said. "Every account, every entity, every property. I want the full picture by Friday. We'll need access to find everything." He left. In the elevator, descending, he stood alone with his reflection in the polished doors and allowed himself, for the first time since the previous night, to feel the specific texture of what was happening. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something older and less manageable, the sensation of having walked confidently across a floor and discovered, mid-stride, that the floor had never been what you thought it was. He had built an empire. He had believed he was standing on solid ground. And now his attorney had just shown him 17 years of documents proving that a significant portion of what he'd taken for granted as his had been built on a structure he had never examined, maintained by a woman he had dismissed as peripheral to the actual business of his life. His driver was waiting outside. Taejun got in the back seat and said nothing for the first 3 blocks. Then he said, "Take me to Riverside." Riverside was a private Korean restaurant in the International District, not listed anywhere public, accessible through an address that appeared to belong to a dry cleaning business, with a separate entrance through the service corridor. Taejun used it for conversations that required walls. He arrived at 11. His 2 oldest captains, Cho Dae-won and Lim Byung-soo, were already at the table. Cho was 55, heavyset, with thick hands and a way of sitting that made him look permanent, like furniture. He had been with Taejun since the beginning, since before there was a syndicate, when it was just 3 men and a distribution arrangement that depended more on mutual intimidation than actual organization. He was the person Taejun trusted most. That was a narrow category. Lim was younger, 48, sharper in the face, faster with numbers. He handled the financial routing between legitimate and illegitimate revenue, a task that required the particular skill of making money look clean without leaving the kind of trace that showed someone had tried to make it look clean. Neither man spoke when Taejun sat down. He ordered tea. He waited for it to arrive. When the server left, he said, "Tell me what I don't know." Cho and Lim exchanged a look. 2 seconds. Quick. But Taejun caught it, and it landed on him like a stone on ice. Not catastrophic, not immediately, but delivering a thin, spreading crack. "Talk," Taejun said. Cho leaned forward, forearms on the table, and lowered his voice even though they were alone. "The federal case. We've been hearing things for 6 months. We thought it was positioning, showing force, seeing who moves. But in the last 2 weeks?" He stopped. Started again. 2 of the warehouse contacts were interviewed, formally, not as witnesses, as targets. "Why didn't I hear this 2 weeks ago?" Lim said. "Because we didn't have confirmation. We heard the same thing 3 times before it was confirmed, and by the time we were certain—" "By the time you were certain," Taejun said, his voice dropping to the register that meant the politeness of the conversation was functionally over. "I had already made other decisions, in public, that are now documented and reported on by half of Seattle's social media." Neither man replied. "The dinner party," Taejun said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact, offered in the flattest possible tone, which was more frightening than an accusation would have been. Someone is going to connect that to a divorce filing. And a divorce filing means discovery. And discovery means people I do not want looking at financial records will have a legal reason to request them. The accounts Lim manages are, I know what the accounts are. I'm telling you that a federal discovery process connected to a divorce proceeding is a different category of problem from a federal investigation we can manage at distance. He picked up his tea, drank, set it down. Who are the two warehouse contacts? Lim gave him the names. Taejun absorbed them. One of the names surprised him. Not because the man was trustworthy. Nobody in this business was trustworthy. That was not the relevant metric. But because the man had too much to lose from cooperation to make cooperation rational, which meant the federal case was offering something worth that calculation. Is Min Cheol moving? Taejun said. The pause before Cho answered was half a second too long. We've seen some positioning, northern distribution lines. Nothing confirmed. How long have you seen positioning? 3 weeks. Taejun looked at Cho for a long moment. Cho did not look away, which was correct. Looking away would have been worse. 3 weeks, Taejun repeated. We were watching it before we reported it because we wanted to understand the shape of it. The shape of it is Min Cheol testing whether I'm distracted. Taejun's voice was quiet and very even. And the answer, apparently, is yes. And now he knows that. Cho said, we can move on the northern contacts. Remind them of their obligations. No. Taejun said it immediately, without consideration, because the calculation was instant and clear. Not yet. If the federal surveillance is active, any movement on the distribution lines is documented. We do nothing that looks like consolidation or retaliation until I understand the scope of what they have. Lim said, there's something else. Taejun waited. The political contacts, the ones Imani managed, the city council relationships, the development board connections. Lim moved a small coffee cup in a short circle on the table, a nervous gesture he probably wasn't aware of. 2 of them have already declined meetings scheduled for next month. Their offices cited scheduling conflicts, but both meetings were confirmed 2 weeks ago. The temperature in Taejun's thinking dropped several degrees. She called them. We don't know that. She didn't have to call them. He stood up. She filed for divorce this morning. They read the news the same as everyone else. They're not declining because their schedules changed. They're declining because she's not going to be standing next to me anymore, and she's the reason they were in the room to begin with. He buttoned his jacket. Find out if Yuna Park has accessed any of the accounts I put in her name in the last 72 hours. Cho blinked. You think? I think I introduced a woman to 40 people last night who had access to 3 accounts and a safe deposit key. He looked at Cho steadily. Check. He walked out through the service corridor without looking back. By the time he reached his car, Cho had already sent someone to verify the accounts. He found out the answer before dinner. Yuna Park had emptied the first account, an operational household account with $340,000 at 9:15 that morning, 2 hours after Imani's attorney filed the divorce paperwork. The second account, a smaller reserve of $80,000, was emptied at 11. The third account, the largest, had a fraud alert triggered at 2 in the afternoon by a withdrawal attempt from a banking terminal in Vancouver, British Columbia. She had taken the jewelry, the watch Taejun had left on the nightstand, a bracelet from the wall safe that she apparently knew the combination to, which told him she had watched him open it at some point, and simply waited. The Vancouver account attempt had failed because the bank's fraud detection flagged the unusual geographic pattern. By that point, Yuna's phone was going directly to voicemail. Her apartment, a place Taejun had leased in Belltown 18 months ago, was empty. Not messy empty, the kind of empty that says someone left in a hurry. Clean empty. The kind of empty that says someone planned. Taejun sat in his study that evening with the information laid out in front of him and spent a long time not moving. His estate was effectively Imani's. His political insulation was gone. His 2 oldest lieutenants had been sitting on information about federal surveillance for weeks. His rival was making moves in the Northern Territory. 2 warehouse contacts were cooperating with federal investigators. And the woman he had staged a public spectacle to announce as the person he loved had been watching the clock since the moment she understood that spectacle was her exit opportunity. He thought about the look on Imani's face as she'd walked to the table and set down the ring. Not anger, not devastation, confirmation. She had looked at him the way you look at something when it finally becomes what you always knew it was going to become. He picked up his phone and called Sung Jin. The Yuna situation, he started. I know. The bank called us an hour ago about the Vancouver attempt. Sung Jin's voice was controlled and careful. We've contacted fraud recovery, but if she's across the border with the cash, forget the cash. He meant it. The money was real, but it was not the point. I need you to look at something else. The dinner party last night, 40 people, social media, news coverage, any recorded reference to what was said. I need to understand the evidentiary exposure if the federal case reaches discovery. Aside, Taijun, if the federal investigation is at the stage where discovery is a realistic concern, we need to have a different conversation than the one we've been having. I know. A criminal defense conversation. I know, Sungjin. Do you want me to reach out to? Not yet. He stood up, walked to the window. The lake was black in the dark, the distant lights of the far shore blurred by the lingering moisture in the air. But prepare. Quietly. Don't move anything that moves visibly. He hung up. He stood at the window for a long time. The house was very quiet. The staff had gone to their quarters. Yuna was gone. Amani had been gone since the previous night. The estate was 4,200 square feet of his own construction, furniture he had chosen, art he had selected, a lake view he had paid for, and it had never felt less like his. He thought about calling someone, one of his captains, maybe, or one of the political contacts who hadn't yet declined the meetings, to apply some version of the pressure those relationships were built to sustain. He thought about getting in his car and driving, which was something he had done in the early years when things got tight. Just driving, long and aimless, letting the motion do something his stillness couldn't. He didn't do any of it. He sat back down in the chair and opened the folder Sungjin had sent, the preliminary divorce filing, and read it from the first page. Amani's attorney was thorough. The document was 37 pages, and it was, as Sungjin had said, very clean. Every asset was categorized, sourced, documented. There were no emotional claims, no accusations, no language designed to wound. It was a financial document. Precise and complete, and exactly as devastating as a financial document could be, which was more devastating than most people assumed until they were sitting across from one. He read it to the last page. Then he set it down and looked at the rain starting again outside the window, and understood, with a completeness that didn't require any particular intelligence, just time and honesty, and the specific kind of quiet that arrives when everything is finished performing, that the ground he had been standing on was not the ground he had built. He had built the empire, but she had been the ground. And 3 days later, when a sealed envelope arrived through a courier address, Taijun did not recognize and could not trace, containing a single photograph, surveillance quality, grainy with distance, showing his rival Seo Min-cheol in conversation with a woman whose federal credentials were visible in the image's corner, the last door sealed shut behind him. There was no version of the next chapter that looked like the previous ones. Whatever came next was going to be something else entirely. Taijun looked at the photograph for a long time before he touched it. It was printed on standard paper, not photo stock, which meant someone had access to a printer but not a darkroom, or had deliberately chosen to make it look disposable, the kind of image you produce when you want someone to receive information without being able to trace the quality of the source. The surveillance angle was from above and to the left, possibly a parking structure or a second-floor window. Min-cheol was in profile, identifiable by the particular set of his shoulders and the scar along his left jawline that he'd carried since his 20s. The woman across from him was turned more toward the camera by accident, her federal credentials visible in the lanyard gap of her open coat. Special Agent Claire Donovan. Taijun knew the name. He had known it for 14 months, which was how long his organization's contacts inside Seattle's legal community had been tracking the Federal Financial Crimes Unit's personnel movements. Donovan had been assigned to the Pacific Northwest Division 18 months ago, transferred from Chicago, where she had spent 6 years dismantling a restaurant and laundry money routing operation that had taken down 11 people and produced 2 suicides before sentencing. She was 39, methodical, and reportedly the kind of investigator who did not take meetings she had not already won. He turned the photograph over. Nothing on the back. No note, no signature, no return address on the courier envelope. The courier service, when Cho called, confirmed the package had been dropped at their Soto district location by a walk-in customer paying cash, no name recorded, 3 days ago. Taijun set the photograph on the desk and sat back. The message was not subtle. Someone wanted him to know that Min-cheol was in contact with federal investigators. The question, the only question that actually mattered, was whether the someone sending the photograph was trying to help him or to move him, because those were different things, and confusing them was the kind of mistake that ended careers and occasionally ended lives. He called Cho. The photograph. Who has the capability and the motive to send it? Cho was quiet for a moment. Not thinking. Cho had already been thinking about this. Tae-jun could tell by the speed with which the silence ended. 3 possibilities. Someone inside Min Cheol's operation who wants to accelerate a conflict between you. A third party who profits from instability between the 2 syndicates. Or federal investigators themselves, running a play. Donovan wouldn't send a photograph of herself. Unless she wanted you to know she existed in a specific context. Sometimes federal investigators make themselves visible on purpose, to apply pressure, to change behavior. Tae-jun picked the photograph up again, looked at Donovan's face. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at Min Cheol, and her expression, even in the grainy surveillance image, was the expression of someone listening with patience. Not the patience of someone who is being polite, but the patience of someone who already has what they need and is letting the other person finish speaking. Set a meeting with Min Cheol, Tae-jun said. Cho went very still on the other end of the line. Tae-jun could feel it through the phone, the way you feel weather change, a sudden drop in ambient pressure. You want to meet Min Cheol. Neutral location, his choice. Tell him I want 40 minutes. Tae-jun, tell him I have something he needs to hear before he makes a decision he can't reverse. He'll understand that. He hung up. The meeting took 4 days to arrange, which was itself information. Min Cheol was either genuinely cautious or deliberately performing caution for an audience Tae-jun couldn't see. They settled on a private room at a Korean bathhouse in the Rainier Valley. Neutral ground in the technical sense, though Tae-jun was aware that neutral ground between 2 criminal operations was always a performance of neutrality rather than actual safety. He went with 1 man. Min Cheol arrived with 2, which told Tae-jun that Min Cheol was either afraid or wanted to project strength, and the distinction between those 2 things was becoming increasingly difficult to read. Seo Min Cheol was 51, lean and angular in the face, with the quality of stillness that some men develop when they have been violent for a long time and have learned that stillness is more frightening than movement. He and Tae-jun had operated in parallel for 11 years, their territories adjacent, their organizations occasionally overlapping at the edges in ways that required negotiation rather than warfare. They were not allies, they were not quite enemies. They were 2 men who understood each other's arithmetic and had thus far found coexistence more profitable than conflict. That calculation, Tae-jun now understood, had changed. They sat across from each other at a plain table in a low-lit room that smelled of eucalyptus and old wood. Min Cheol's 2 men stood near the door. Tae-jun's single escort stayed outside. Min Cheol poured tea without being asked. "You look tired," Min Cheol said. His English was accented but precise. He used it rather than Korean when he wanted to remind someone that he had range. "I look like a man who has been having an interesting week," Tae-jun said. Min Cheol smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind that exists at the surface without involving anything below it. "The divorce. I heard. Everyone heard. Imani Caldwell is a formidable woman." "She is." Tae-jun picked up the tea Min Cheol had poured, drank, set it down. "You've been moving on the northern distribution lines." Min Cheol said nothing, which was a confirmation. "I'm not here about the northern lines," Tae-jun said. "I'm here about Claire Donovan." The surface smile remained on Min Cheol's face for 2 seconds after Tae-jun said the name. Then it went away. Not quickly. It receded, the way water recedes, slowly, and with the pretense of naturalness. "I don't know who that is," Min Cheol said. "You met with her 8 days ago, parking structure adjacent to the federal building on Stewart. You were there for approximately 40 minutes. Tae-jun slid the photograph across the table and watched Min Cheol's eyes drop to it. "I want to understand what you offered her." Min Cheol looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he pushed it back across the table without touching the edges, the way someone handles something they don't want their fingerprints on. "Where did you get this?" "Doesn't matter. It matters to me." "What you offered Donovan," Tae-jun said again, keeping his voice level, "matters more. Because if you're feeding my financial records to a federal investigation in exchange for territory protection, we have a problem that is significantly larger than the northern distribution lines. Mincho leaned back in his chair. He looked at Taejun with an expression that was almost, but not quite, pity. It was the expression of a man who has been ahead of the conversation for some time and is deciding how much of that advantage to reveal. You spent 17 years, Mincheol said slowly, believing that your wife's reputation was decorative, that all the meetings she attended and the relationships she maintained were social performance, accessories. He paused. I spent 7 of those years watching you operate with a level of federal tolerance that no one in our business should have, and I asked myself why. I spent a long time asking myself why. Taejun's breathing had not changed. His hands were still on the table. And then, Min Cheol continued, Malcolm Caldwell died, and I watched Imani inherit, and I watched her maintain every relationship Malcolm had built, and I watched those relationships continue to create a perimeter around your operation that federal investigators couldn't easily penetrate without touching things that connected to legitimate banking, legitimate development, legitimate political relationships. He looked at Taejun steadily. She was your insulation. She's been your insulation for 15 years, and you dismissed her in front of 40 witnesses. What did you offer, Donovan? Minchel picked up his tea. Drank. I offered her perspective, he said, on the financial structure of the Kong operation, the routing mechanisms, the legitimate business overlay. He set down the cup. I told her that the Caldwell relationships were the key to understanding why the syndicate had been so difficult to penetrate, and that those relationships were now, as of the morning of the divorce filing, no longer operative. Taejun sat very still. You told a federal investigator that my insulation was gone. I told a federal investigator the truth. Mincheol's voice was even. The truth that you announced yourself, in a dining room, in front of witnesses, several of whom had already spoken to federal investigators in other contexts. You accelerated their timeline. I clarified their picture. The distinction was a razor. Taejun felt it. He stood up. You understand, Taejun said, that what you've done is not a negotiating move. This is not territory. This is not distribution. You've pointed a federal investigation at my operation and then moved on my northern lines while I was managing the consequences. That is not how 11 years of coexistence works. Mincho looked up at him without moving from the chair. 11 years of coexistence works until it doesn't. You made yourself vulnerable. I responded to vulnerability. That's the only rule that has ever existed in this business. And you wrote it yourself 20 years ago when you were the one responding to someone else's weakness. Taejun put on his jacket. You should be careful, he said, about the investigators you believe you're steering. Donovan didn't get where she is by being steered. He walked to the door. Minchel said behind him, the same was true of Imani. Taejun left without responding. In the car, driving back toward the waterfront, he sat in the rear seat and looked out the window at the passing city, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific physical sensation of being outmaneuvered, not on one side but on multiple sides simultaneously, by people he had underestimated in different ways and for different reasons. He had underestimated Imani because he had confused proximity with dependency. He had underestimated Min Cheol because he had confused historical parallelism with permanent stability. He was beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing a person can do is mistake a pattern for a guarantee. He called Sung Jin. I need criminal defense, Taejun said. Not preparation, actual engagement. Who is the best we can get in the next 48 hours? Sung Jin was quiet for 1 second. Then, I'll make calls tonight. Someone with federal experience. Financial crimes specifically. Not someone who handles the obvious criminal work. Someone who understands the financial architecture. There's a firm in Portland, former federal prosecutor. She handles... Get her on the phone tomorrow morning. He hung up. The estate came into view as the car turned down the private road. It looked the same as it always had. The long facade, the windows, the lake behind it going silver in the late afternoon light. It did not feel the same. It felt, with a clarity that Taejun was beginning to accept rather than resist, like a property in the late stages of belonging to someone else. He went inside and straight to his study and sat down with the preliminary divorce filing and the financial documents Sung Jin had sent and the photograph and a yellow legal pad, and he began to write down everything he knew about every financial structure connected to his operation, legitimate and otherwise. The way you catalog a house before a fire, not because cataloging prevents the fire, but because afterward, When you are standing in the ash, you want to know exactly what was lost. He worked for 4 hours. At 11 that night, Cho called. The 2 warehouse contacts, Cho said. The one's being interviewed. What? One of them, Taejun. He's not being interviewed as a target. Taejun's pen stopped moving. He's been cooperating for 4 months. He's a witness. They flipped him in August. August, 4 months ago. Taejun had been at a waterfront fundraiser in August, standing beside Imani, shaking hands with a city council member, and one of his warehouse captains had already been sitting across from federal investigators, explaining the routing structures of the Kong Syndicate's financial operations. How much does he know? Taejun said. Enough. He handled the Bellevue routing. He knows the shell sequence. The shell sequence was the mechanism through which Kang Syndicate revenue passed through 3 layers of legitimate business entities before emerging as clean income. It was Lim's construction, 6 years old, refined twice, and it was the thing Taejun had believed was the most protected element of his operation. Who else? We're trying to determine Cho. Taejun's voice was very quiet. Who else? A breath on the other end of the line. The kind of breath that precedes a sentence someone doesn't want to say. We think Lim has been in contact with them. We're not certain, but there are 2 meetings in the last 6 weeks that we can't account for, and his phone has been dark in ways that don't match his pattern. Lim Byung-soo, 48 years old, 11 years inside the Kong operation, the architect of every financial structure Taejun had used to keep his empire's money clean. The man who knew, in granular detail, exactly how every dollar moved between criminal activity and legitimate business. Find out, Taejun said. If it's true, find out first, then we'll discuss what it means. He set the phone down. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes on the wall opposite, and breathed in the specific way he had trained himself to breathe when something catastrophic was arriving, steadily, through the nose, slow enough to prevent the body from beginning the panic spiral that the brain was already circling. If Lim was cooperating, the federal case was not approaching anymore. It was already assembled. Lim knew the names of every shell company, every routing node, every banking contact, every legitimate business owner who had knowingly or unknowingly participated in the financial architecture of the Kong Syndicate. He knew which politicians had accepted which arrangements and under what structure. He knew which banking relationships had been cultivated through Imani's professional credibility and which had been cultivated through less transparent means. He knew everything. And if he had been talking to Donovan for 6 weeks, then Donovan already knew everything. And the question was no longer whether the federal case was strong enough to prosecute. The question was why they hadn't moved yet. Taejun looked at the photograph on the corner of his desk. Min Cheol and Donovan. 8 days ago. He thought about what Donovan's expression had meant in that photograph. The patient listening of someone who already has what she needs. He thought about what Min Cheol had said. I clarified their picture. And then he thought about something he had not yet thought about, because it required assembling pieces that he had previously kept in separate categories. He thought about the timing. Lim cooperating for 4 months. Min Cheol meeting Donovan 8 days ago. The divorce filed the morning after the dinner party. The political contacts beginning to pull away within 72 hours. The photograph arriving at his address through a courier account that had no trace. The photograph. He picked it up again. Someone had sent it to him. Someone who knew where he lived, knew his courier patterns well enough to use the right service, and had chosen to show him Min Cheol and Donovan together at a moment when that information was maximally useful to him and maximally destabilizing. Not destabilizing to his confidence. Destabilizing to any plan he might construct to handle the federal situation quietly. If he acted on the photograph by confronting Min Cheol, which he had done, that confrontation was now recorded somewhere in Min Cheol's accounting of events. If Min Cheol was cooperating with federal investigators, then Min Cheol had now told Donovan that Taejun knew about their meeting, which meant Donovan knew he was aware, which meant the federal investigators' timeline had just accelerated because an aware target was a different problem than an unaware one. He had walked into the meeting with Min Cheol, believing he was gathering information. He had actually been providing it. The photograph was not a warning, it was a mechanism. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his study. The ceiling of a house that was not his, in a marriage that was over, with an empire that was being disassembled from 3 directions simultaneously, and allowed himself for a full minute to simply feel the weight of where he was. He had built everything on the assumption that strength was self-sustaining, that once you had reached a certain size and a certain level of fear, the structure maintained itself by the gravity of its own mass. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about Imani. He had been wrong about Minchiol. He had been wrong about Lim, apparently. And he had been wrong, possibly most fundamentally, about the nature of what he had created, believing it was an empire when it was actually a performance, sustained not by any permanent structural integrity, but by the continuous effort of people he had taken for granted. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Seattle area code. He answered. A woman's voice, measured, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who has delivered versions of this sentence many times and has learned to give it without inflection. Mr. Kang, my name is Special Agent Claire Donovan. I'm outside your property. I'm not here with a warrant. I'm here because I'd prefer to have a conversation before things become significantly less conversational, if you're willing. Taijun looked at the window. Through the glass, at the end of the driveway, he could see the faint outline of a dark sedan, its headlights off. He thought about saying no. He ran the calculation in the time it took to exhale. What saying no bought him, how many days it might purchase, what those days would look like against what was already assembled against him. He thought about Imani's face when she walked across the dining room, the confirmation in it. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. He stood up, put on his jacket, and walked toward the front door of a house that was no longer his, to meet a federal agent who had been building a case against him for almost 2 years. In a city where the man he had trusted to protect his money was almost certainly already talking, and his rival had already provided the frame. There was no version of the next conversation that left him where he was. He opened the door. The night air was cold and still, and the lake behind the house was completely dark, and Taijun Kong walked down the steps of his own estate toward the end of everything he had spent 20 years constructing, with the specific steadiness of a man who has finally run out of directions to run and has decided, perhaps for the first time in his life, to simply stand still and face the thing coming toward him. Claire Donovan was shorter than Taijun had expected. He didn't know why he'd built a different image. 14 months of hearing her name had constructed something in his mind, taller, harder, in the face, the kind of federal agent who looked like she'd been assembled specifically for the purpose of dismantling criminal organizations. The woman standing at the foot of his driveway was perhaps 5'4", wearing a dark coat that had seen better seasons, with the kind of face that looked like it had been tired for a long time and had made a separate peace with that fact. She held up her credentials when he reached the bottom of the steps. He glanced at them without stopping. "I know who you are," he said. "Then we can skip that part." She put the credentials away. "Is there somewhere we can talk that isn't a driveway?" He considered refusing, considered making her stand in the cold, establishing some minimal territorial dominance. Then he considered that the woman in front of him had been building a federal financial crimes case for 2 years and had chosen to arrive at his home without a warrant at 11 at night rather than a team with paperwork at 6 in the morning, and that this choice was itself a message worth reading correctly. He gestured toward the side entrance. "There's a sitting room off the garden." She followed him without speaking. The sitting room was adjacent to the main house but separated by a glass corridor. Imani had used it for working meetings, preferring the light and the partial view of the garden to the formality of the main study. It still had papers on the side table. A coffee cup Imani had left the week before the dinner party, which the housekeeper had not touched, which Taijun had not told her to remove. Donovan looked at the room without commentary. She sat in one of the chairs without being invited. She set a slim folder on the table between them and did not open it. "I'll be direct," she said. "Please. The financial crimes case against the Kang Syndicate is complete, by which I mean we have sufficient evidence to indict on 6 counts of money laundering, 3 counts of RICO conspiracy, and 2 counts of obstruction. We have financial records, routing documentation, and testimony from 2 cooperating witnesses who participated directly in the operations under discussion." She paused. "If we file tomorrow, you are looking at a trial you will not win, and a sentencing recommendation that begins at 22 years and works upward, depending on what the jury finds credible." Taejun sat across from her. His hands were in his lap. His face was doing the thing it did. The composed surface stillness that had served him in rooms for 20 years. "Then why aren't you filing tomorrow?" he said. "Because we want Seo Min Cheol more." The sentence was flat and absolute. the way sentences are when they don't require any supporting structure because they are simply true. Min Keol has been operating in the Pacific Northwest for 11 years, Donovan continued. His financial structure is significantly more protected than yours because he never had a Caldwell equivalent insulating him. He built differently, deeper, more distributed. Our case against him is functional, but not clean. Your operation and his have intersected at multiple points over the past decade. You have documentation we don't have. You have organizational intelligence that would take us years to replicate through investigation. She looked at him steadily. You also know things about Min Cheol's political relationships in this region that we have evidence of but cannot sufficiently source. Tae-jun said nothing. Here is what we're offering, Donovan said. Full cooperation, documents, testimony, organizational intelligence. In exchange, federal prosecutors recommend a substantially reduced sentence. We're talking about a range that begins at 4 years and allows for minimum security placement. We also extend protection agreements to several individuals in your organization whose cooperation is not the primary objective, but whose sentences would otherwise be significant. You want me to dismantle my own empire, Tae-jun said. We want you to confirm what we already have and fill the gaps we don't. The dismantling, she said, is going to happen either way. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away, did not shift in the chair, did not perform patience. She simply waited, in the manner of someone who has made the offer and is now allowing the other person to arrive at the only logical destination. I want 48 hours, he said. You have 24. He almost pushed back. Then he didn't. 24, he said. She stood, collected her folder, buttoned her coat. Mr. Kong, one more thing. She paused at the entrance to the glass corridor. Min Cheol is aware that you and I have now spoken. He has people watching this property. He knew I was coming before I arrived. Whatever you decide in the next 24 hours, be aware that he will be making decisions based on the assumption that you've already said yes. She left. Tae-jun sat in the room that had been Imani's and listened to the sound of Donovan's car reversing out of the driveway, and then silence, and then just the ambient quiet of a large house with nobody in it. Min Cheol knew she had come, which meant Min Cheol was already reacting, which meant the 24 hours Donovan had offered was not a grace period. It was a countdown. He called Cho at 11:43. Cho answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. Min Cheol has eyes on the property, Tae-jun said. I need you to assume that every phone I use from this point forward is being monitored by at least 2 separate parties. Speak accordingly. Understood. A pause. Donovan. Yes. And? 24 hours to decide. Cho was quiet for 4 seconds. Then, the limb situation. It's confirmed. I have documentation of 3 separate meetings. 2 at a coffee shop in Fremont, 1 at a law office in Bellevue that serves as a federal witness coordination point. 6 weeks of contact. Tae-jun absorbed this without external reaction, though something in his chest did a specific thing, a tightening, like a hand closing around a fist that was already clenched. Lim Byung-soo, 11 years. He had been there before the shell structure existed. He had helped design it. He had sat across test operational security with the investment of a man who believed in the project, or performed believing in the project. Does he know that we know? Tae-jun said. No. Keep it that way for the next 12 hours. He hung up. I went to the kitchen and made coffee badly. He had never learned to use the machine properly, always leaving it to the housekeeper or Imani, and stood at the counter with the imperfect result and drank it while looking at the dark window above the sink, in which he could see his own reflection overlaid against the black lake outside. He looked older than he expected. Not dramatically, not aged overnight in the way that people described in moments of fictional crisis. Just tired. Specifically tired, in the face, around the eyes, the way sustained tension eventually shows through regardless of how disciplined your composure is. He had been disciplined for 20 years. He could feel the discipline costing something now. Compound interest on suppression. He thought about Imani sleeping in the Capitol Hill apartment, the one he had always considered a minor extravagance. He thought about her reading the divorce filing she had commissioned with her own attorney and her own legal infrastructure, reviewing it the way she reviewed everything, systematically, without sentiment contaminating the process. He thought about what it had cost her, not the money or the property or the legal maneuvering, but the other thing. The years of knowing, of understanding the gap between what the marriage was and what she had told herself it might become, of maintaining the Caldwell structure quietly and completely as a kind of parallel self-protection that required her to hold, simultaneously, the version of her life that was real and the version she was choosing to sustain for reasons that probably stopped being simple love sometime around the 7th or 8th year. He had never asked her. That was the thing he kept arriving at. He had never asked her what any of it cost. He poured the rest of the coffee out and went to the study and began the most methodical work of his life. Over the next 9 hours, Kang Taijun assembled every document in his possession related to the financial operations of the Kong Syndicate. Physical files from the safe behind the bookcase, encrypted drives from the secondary safe in the basement, the one concealed beneath the utility panel that nobody knew about except himself and Cho. Digital records accessed through 2 separate encrypted servers, one domestic, one routed through a proxy in Singapore that Lim had established, but Tae-jun had quietly maintained independent access to for exactly this kind of contingency. He had always known this day was a possibility. He had structured his contingency around surviving it, not preventing it. The documents were comprehensive: shell company registrations, routing ledgers, banking correspondence, property acquisition records, the names and account details of every political contact who had received direct financial benefit from Kang operations over 11 years. The names and locations of every business owner who had participated in money cleaning, knowingly or under sufficient pressure that their participation was unambiguous. Records of Min Keol's operations where they intersected with Kang territory, distribution arrangements, shared resource agreements, 2 specific financial transfers that connected Min Keol's revenue directly to 3 shell entities whose paper trail Donovan's team had apparently not yet reached. Those 3 shell entities were the gaps Donovan had described without naming. He was naming them now. At 7:15 in the morning, he called Sung Jin. "I need the Portland attorney on the phone in 1 hour," he said, "and I need you to initiate the cooperation framework, formal, through proper channels. I will be available to meet with federal representatives at 2 this afternoon." Sung-jin was quiet for 3 seconds. "You're certain?" "I've been certain for approximately 9 hours, Tae-jun said. "Make the calls." By 8, Seattle had begun its morning in the particular way it did in November. Gray light pushing slowly through cloud cover, the lake shifting from black to the color of old pewter, traffic beginning its accumulation on the bridge visible from the estate's eastern windows. Tae-jun stood in the garden for 7 minutes because he needed cold air and an outdoor space that was not the inside of his own head. His phone rang at 8:22. Cho. "Min Chol moved on the Tacoma warehouse overnight," Cho said. His voice was compressed in the way voices go when the information inside them is too large for the container. "He sent 4 men. Our people were told to stand down or face consequences. The inventory is gone. The facility is... They burned it." Tae-jun stood in the garden with the phone at his ear and the cold settling into the fabric of his jacket. "Anyone hurt?" 2 of ours. Not critically. They stood down when they were supposed to and got hit anyway." Tae-jun closed his eyes for 2 seconds. "He's not waiting to see what I decide," Tae-jun said. "No. He already decided, the Donovan meeting. He's been planning this since before I knew she existed. The calculation was fast and cold and landed fully formed. He handed her enough to pressure me into cooperation. Knowing cooperation destroys my operation. Knowing the collapse of my operation opens my territory. He's using the federal case as a mechanism to take the ground without the war." Cho said nothing because there was nothing to say. It was accurate. "The 2 men from Tacoma," Tae-jun said, "get them medical care and then move them somewhere Min Cheol's people don't know about. And Cho, find Lim. Find him as in, find him. Bring him to the Riverside location. I need an hour with him before 2 o'clock." He went back inside. He arrived at Riverside at 10:30. Lim was already there, brought by 2 of Cho's people who had collected him from his Bellevue apartment with a courtesy that was formal enough to communicate that the courtesy was the last of its kind. Lim was sitting at the plain table in the private room, and he looked when Tae-jun walked in like a man who had been running a long race and had just been told the finish line was not where he'd been told it was. He looked exhausted. And this was what Tae-jun noted first, because it was the most telling thing. He looked unsurprised. Tae-jun sat down. He did not speak immediately. He poured water from the carafe on the table. Drank. Set the glass down. How long? He said. Lim's jaw moved. He looked at his hands on the table, then at Taijun. 6 weeks, he said. What did you give them? The shell sequence, the routing nodes, the banking contact names. Lim's voice was flat, drained of the inflection that normal speech carries, the kind of flatness that arrives after a person has crossed a line and spent enough time on the other side to stop feeling the crossing. The property acquisition records for the East Side development fronts, the account structures for the political payments. Each item landed like something heavy dropped on a hard floor. Why? Taijun said. Lim looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying, from not sleeping. My son, he said. Taijun waited. He was picked up 8 weeks ago. Possession with intent, third offense. The federal prosecutors offered to make it disappear. The whole case, the priors, the record, if I cooperated. They had a window. They said the window was closing. He exhaled, a ragged, exhausted sound. He's 23. He was looking at 7 years minimum. Taijun looked at Lim for a long time. He had known Lim for 11 years. He had been at Lim's son's high school graduation. He had sent a case of expensive whiskey when the boy was accepted to the University of Washington, which he subsequently attended for 2 years before dropping out and making the sequence of decisions that had apparently led here. You should have come to me, Taijun said. They told me if I came to you, the offer disappeared and the case against my son accelerated. Lim's hands opened on the table, a gesture of emptiness. They knew I couldn't take that risk. They used your son as the mechanism. Yes. Taijun stood up. He walked to the wall, stood facing it for a moment, then turned back. I am not going to hurt you, he said. I need you to understand that clearly. Whatever you're sitting here expecting, that's not what's happening. Lim looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between relief and confusion, as if kindness had arrived in a form he couldn't immediately process. The cooperation agreement I'm filing this afternoon, Taijun said. I'm going to tell my attorneys to include language protecting several individuals in the organization whose cooperation was coerced rather than voluntary. Your name will be in that language. Your son's case will be addressed as part of the framework. Taijun, don't. He said it quietly, not harshly. Just listen. What they built through your testimony is already built. I can't undo it, and I'm not going to try. What I can do is make sure the framework I'm constructing treats the people who were put in impossible positions as differently as the law allows from the people who made the choices freely. He paused. Go home. Don't contact anyone from the operation. Wait for my attorney to reach out. Lim stood slowly, the way people stand when their body has been holding tension for weeks and has forgotten how to release it gracefully. At the door, he stopped. I'm sorry, he said. I know, Taijun said. When Lim was gone, Cho came in from the corridor where he'd been standing outside the door. The 2 o'clock meeting, Cho said. We're still going. Taijun picked up his phone. But first, Min Cheol. He dialed Min Cheol's number directly. It rang 4 times. Min Cheol answered. The Tacoma warehouse, Taijun said. A misunderstanding between distribution contacts, Min Cheol said. His voice was calm. Constructed calm, but still. I regret that it became physical. You burned the facility. Property disputes can become heated. Taijun breathed in once, controlled, through his nose. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it carefully. The documents I'm bringing to the Federal Cooperation meeting this afternoon include 3 shell entities that connect your revenue streams to financial structures. Your team has apparently not disclosed. Donovan doesn't have them yet. She will have them at 2:15. A pause. The meeting with her that you had 8 days ago, whatever you gave her, whatever arrangement you believe you constructed, this afternoon changes the shape of it, significantly. A silence on Min Cheol's end. 3 seconds. 4. You're cooperating, Min Cheol said. I'm cooperating fully and specifically. Taijun's voice was even. Everything, Min Cheol. The Northern Lines, the Tacoma arrangement, the Vancouver account structures, the 2 city council relationships you've maintained through a property management front in Bellevue. He paused. All of it. The silence this time was longer. You're destroying yourself, Min Cheol said. Yes, Taijun said, but I'm taking you with me. He hung up. The 2 o'clock meeting was held at the Federal Building on Stewart, in a conference room on the 14th floor with a window that looked north toward Puget Sound. Donovan was there with two other agents and a federal prosecutor named Walsh, 40-something, gray at the temples, who reviewed documents with the detached concentration of someone for whom catastrophic financial revelations are simply another Tuesday. Taejun arrived with Sungjin and the Portland attorney, whose name was Patricia Rowe, and who had the quality of someone whose intelligence was running faster than the room around her at all times, while her exterior gave nothing away. The documents were transferred, digitally and physically. The shell entities were named. The routing connections were laid out. The political payment structures were disclosed. The Vancouver account architecture connecting to Min Cheol's operation was walked through in detail by Taejun himself, with Rowe watching every question and occasionally stopping a line of inquiry with a precision that Taejun found, despite everything, genuinely impressive. It took 3 hours and 40 minutes. At 5:50 in the afternoon, Walsh looked at the final document and looked at Rowe. "We'll need 48 hours to verify," Walsh said. "Verification begins tonight," Donovan said, looking at something on her laptop. "We can move on the Min Cheol structures within 72 hours if everything documents is represented." Rowe said, "The protection language for the coerced witnesses. We'll review the list and that's non-negotiable," Rowe said pleasantly, in the tone of someone for whom pleasantness is simply the aesthetic wrapper around absolute firmness. "The list is attached to the cooperation framework. It is part of the framework. It doesn't review separately." Walsh looked at Donovan. Donovan said, "We'll include it." Rowe made a note. Taejun sat through all of it. He answered the questions he was asked directly. He did not embellish. He did not deflect. He did not perform cooperation in the way that some people perform it, with visible reluctance that is actually a negotiation. He simply answered. He had decided to do this completely or not at all. When it was over, they walked to the elevator in silence. He and Sungjin and Rowe. In the lobby, Sungjin said something about next steps, and Taejun nodded without processing the specific words, because his mind was somewhere else. It was with the document. Specifically, it was with the moment Walsh had turned to the third set of pages and found the political payment records, and the way Walsh's expression had done a brief, controlled thing, a tightening, a recognition, that told Taejun the names on those pages were names Walsh had been wanting for longer than the Kong Syndicate case. He had given them names that Donovan's 2-year investigation had not produced. In the parking structure, before he got in his car, Rowe stopped him. "Tonight," she said, "you should not be at the estate." "I know." Min Cheol received confirmation of what occurred in that room approximately 20 minutes ago. "I don't know his exact intelligence network, but I know federal proceedings leak in specific directions, and this one will." "I'll be at the Capitol Hill apartment," he said. She looked at him. "The one registered to your wife's estate." "My estranged wife's estate." He paused. "She's not there. She's been at the Caldwell office building this week." Rowe nodded once. "I'll have someone drive past tonight, for visibility purposes." He drove to the Capitol Hill apartment alone, dismissing his driver 3 blocks from the building and walking the remainder through evening foot traffic, collar up, hands in his coat pockets, one more person moving through a city that did not notice him. The apartment was exactly as it had been when he'd last seen it, clean and slightly empty and smelling of Imani's particular preferences, which he could not identify as any specific scent, but which were present in the aggregate, the way a person is present in a space they've occupied for a long time. He sat in the kitchen for a while. His phone lit up at 8 with a call from Cho. "Min Cheol's people showed at the estate," Cho said. 4 vehicles. They didn't go inside. They stopped at the gate, stayed 15 minutes and left. "A demonstration." "Yes." "Were you there?" "I was close enough." "Go home, Cho. Tonight everything is already in motion or it isn't. There's nothing left to protect physically." A pause. "Taejun." Cho's voice was different for a moment, stripped of the operational distance, something older in it. "What happens now?" Taejun looked at the table in front of him. Imani's apartment. Imani's table. A woman who had spent 15 years building a parallel structure to protect herself from the collapse she had seen coming, who had walked out of a room of 40 people with her ring in her pocket and 4 words ready to send. "Now," Taejun said, "we find out whether I built anything that was worth what it cost the people around me." He set the phone down. At 9:40, his personal phone received a message from a number he recognized. Minchul's personal line, which they had used for direct communication twice in 11 years. 4 words. "You've made an enemy." Taejun looked at the message for a moment. Then he set the phone face down on Amani's kitchen table and sat in the quiet apartment with the city moving outside the windows, and understood with absolute clarity that the version of his life that had existed for 20 years was finished. Not ending, not transitioning, but finished. The way a fire is finished, when the last material that can burn has burned, and what remains is heat and ash and the outline of what the structure used to be. Min Kyol would be arrested. The timeline Donovan had given was 72 hours for initial movement, longer for the full coordinated operation. The documents Taejun had provided that afternoon were enough. Rowe had confirmed it with the particular neutral confidence of an attorney who knows the difference between sufficient and overwhelming. His own surrender, formal, voluntary, with Rowe present, was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Sungjin had prepared the estate documents for transition. The Caldwell Holding Company would receive notification of the mortgage call, which Amani's trust would process through its own legal mechanism, which Amani would learn about from Naomi Whitaker, not from Taejun. He had decided not to contact her. He had decided this for a specific reason, that any contact he made at this point would be, regardless of his intention, another way of placing his need in front of her choices. She had made her choices with extraordinary precision and at considerable personal cost over a very long time. The least he could do was allow those choices to proceed without him standing in the frame. He would write her a letter. Not tonight. When there was enough distance from tonight to allow honesty without the contamination of immediate desperation. When he could say what he needed to say without any part of it being a play. He pulled a piece of the apartment's notepad paper toward him, the kind Imani used for development notes, plain white, printed with Caldwell Urban Renewal across the top, and he sat with a pen in his hand and the blank page in front of him, and let the weight of the 24 hours settle into his body in the way that weight settles when you stop trying to manage it upright. He didn't write anything yet. He just sat with the pen and the paper and the city outside and the ash of everything he had built cooling somewhere in the distance behind him, and he let himself finally, fully, without any remaining performance of control, understand the magnitude of what the woman who had walked out of his dining room 2 weeks ago had actually been carrying all those years, and what it meant that she had carried it so carefully, and what it said about the kind of person she was that she had done so without asking him to notice. He pressed the pen to the paper. The first word he wrote was her name. He wrote her name and then stopped. The pen sat against the paper without moving. The kitchen of Imani's apartment was very quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to a space maintained carefully but not lived in fully, where the absence of another person's ordinary sounds becomes a presence of its own. No coffee brewing, no footsteps overhead, no faint music from another room. Just the rain restarting outside, touching the windows in the hesitant way November rain touches things in Seattle, as if testing the surface before committing. Taejun looked at the 2 words on the page. Her name. He had written it in the manner he had always said it in his head, which was different from how he had said it aloud in the years of their marriage. Aloud it had become functional. Imani, said the way you say the name of someone whose location in the house you need to establish. Imani, said across a room full of guests to redirect her attention to something he wanted managed. Imani, said on the phone when he was running late and needed her to cover an absence in the way she had always covered his absences, smoothly and without complaint and without anyone noticing the covering. In his head, in the private acoustics of his own mind, he had always said her name the way he had said it the first time, at 29 years old, at a charity development event in a room full of people he had attended for reasons that had nothing to do with charity. When he had introduced himself to a woman standing at the edge of a conversation and she had turned and looked at him with the specific attention of someone who was already measuring what she was seeing against what she actually knew. He had said her name and she had said hers, and he had thought, with the clarity that arrives sometimes before the analytical mind engages and runs its calculations, this one is different. He had been right about that. He had been right about very little else. He set the pen down and sat back in the chair, and let himself feel the weight of the evening, not as a crisis to be managed, but as a thing to be experienced, which was different and more difficult and something he had not, in 20 years of building an empire, learned how to do. He had learned to move through weight, to redistribute it, to use it, to convert its pressure into forward motion. He had never learned to simply sit inside it and let it be what it was. He sat inside it now. Outside, the rain had committed. It came against the windows in steady, quiet sheets, consistent and without drama, the kind of rain that doesn't announce anything because it doesn't need to. It simply falls. At some point, he didn't check the time. He picked up the pen again. He did not write what he had planned to write. He had come to this table with a version already assembled in his mind, structured, honest in its facts, appropriately contained. A document, essentially. He had written documents his entire adult life. Agreements, instructions, the kind of correspondence that communicated what it needed to communicate while preserving strategic distance from anything that could be read as exposure. What came out instead was not a document. He wrote about the dinner party, not from his side of it, but from hers, reconstructed as honestly as he could from what he now understood about what she had walked into that night. He wrote about the timing, that he had known she was on her way, that the announcement had been calibrated for her arrival, that the woman in the burgundy dress had been positioned where a wife would stand, because positioning was one of the tools he had spent decades refining, and he had used it on her, the woman who had spent 17 years standing in that position without ever being positioned. He wrote that down. He didn't soften it. He wrote about her father, Malcolm Caldwell, who had sat across from Taejun 3 months before Taejun proposed to his daughter, and asked him, in the particular quiet and direct manner that Malcolm used for things he considered important, what Taejun intended to build with his life. Taejun had answered the way he answered such questions then, with confidence and vagueness, the combination that most people read as vision. Malcolm had listened without expression and then said, simply, that he hoped Taejun understood the difference between building something and occupying something someone else built. Taejun had not understood the comment at the time. He had filed it as the protective skepticism of a father who had not yet decided whether to trust the man asking for his daughter. Understood it now as something else entirely. An accurate assessment of what Malcolm had already seen in him, delivered once, without embellishment, because Malcolm Caldwell was not the kind of man who repeated himself. He wrote, "Your father saw me clearly from the beginning. He built the structure that protected you because he knew, before you did, or before you were willing to admit it, that you would eventually need protection from a direction you hadn't fully accepted. I spent 17 years telling myself his distrust was competitive, one powerful man measuring another. The truth is simpler and harder than that. He saw what I was. He loved you enough to build you a way out before you knew you needed one." He wrote about the ring, how he had picked it up from the dining room table after the last guest had gone, while Yuna was upstairs and the staff were clearing the last of the evening away, and how he had stood with it in his palm and tried to locate within himself the appropriate emotion, and found, instead, only the flat and oddly cold recognition that he had just done something irreversible, and that the irreversibility was not what troubled him. He had done irreversible things before, many of them, in the service of the Empire, but that this particular irreversibility was the first one he had enacted without any calculation of what it would cost him, because he had genuinely not believed she had anything in her power to cost him. He wrote, "I was wrong about that in a way that I didn't understand until Sung Jin laid the financial documents on the table the morning after. But even the financial reality wasn't the real wrongness. The real wrongness was deeper and older. I had decided, somewhere in the middle years of our marriage, that you were safe to take for granted. Not because I stopped caring about you, but because I had confused your reliability with simplicity. You showed up. You managed. You stood beside me. You maintained what needed maintaining. And I converted all of that into evidence that you needed me, rather than understanding it as evidence that you were, consistently and at considerable personal cost, choosing to be present in a situation that gave you less than you deserved." He wrote for 2 hours. When he finished, he read it back once. It was not a literary document. It was not polished. There were sentences that were too long, and places where the honesty arrived clumsily because the writer had not yet developed the vocabulary for what he was trying to say. Only the necessity of trying to say it. He left those places as they were. Cleaning them up would be a service to his own image, and his own image was not the point of the letter. He folded the pages, addressed the envelope, and set it on the counter. He would give it to Ro in the morning with instructions to hold it until after Tuesday. He went to sleep on Amani's couch, which was too short for him, and slept without dreaming, and woke before the alarm in the particular alertness of a man whose body has been living in emergency mode long enough to have forgotten how to transition out of it. The 3 days before Tuesday had a specific texture that he had not anticipated, the texture of administrative finality. The practical business of ending. Rowe's weekly calls had prepared him for the legal architecture of it, the cooperation framework, the sentence recommendation, the formal surrender process. But nothing had quite prepared him for the accumulation of smaller closings that surrounded the large one. He called Sungjin on Sunday morning, and they went through the remaining asset structures with the thoroughness of men completing an inventory after a flood, cataloging what remained and confirming what was gone. The legitimate restaurant in the International District. 2 vehicles in his name that hadn't been seized because they were unambiguously personal property with documented purchase histories. A savings account in a Korean bank with holdings that were clean and modest and sufficient for the period ahead. Everything else was either Imani's or the federal government's, or irretrievably connected to operations that had been formally acknowledged and surrendered. The Vancouver condo, Sungjin said. The joint property. You could still contest. Let it go, Taejun said. It's potentially 300,000 in equity. Sungjin, let it go. A pause. Understood. Is there anything left that I need to sign in person before Tuesday? 2 documents. I'll have them at the office Monday morning. He signed them Monday morning, standing at Sungjin's desk, with Seattle laid out below through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The same view he had seen the morning after the dinner party, when Sungjin had spread the financial documents across the conference table, and Taejun had understood for the first time the shape of what he had never bothered to examine. That morning the city had looked indifferent. This morning it looked clear, washed by the November rain into something almost specific, the light sharp enough to make the distances visible. He signed both documents without reading them. Rowe had read them. That was sufficient. At the elevator, Sungjin said, Taejun. He turned. Sungjin was 61 years old. He had been Taejun's attorney for 14 years, which meant he had been present for most of the empire's legal architecture and all of its collapse. I was not a man who made personal statements to clients. He maintained at all times the professional distance that good attorneys understand is protective of both parties. He said, for whatever it's worth, the manner in which you did this, the completeness of it. I've been in this work for 30 years. I have not often seen it done this way. Taejun looked at him. It cost more than it had to, Sungjin said. What you gave them. You could have cooperated with less and the sentence wouldn't have changed materially. I know. Why more? Taejun thought about Lim's son, 23 years old, facing 7 years for decisions made, with the limited and skewed perspective of a young man who had grown up adjacent to an organization whose glamour had been more visible than its consequences. He thought about the warehouse workers who had been caught in the Tacoma operation, 2 of whom had families, 1 of whom had worked at that facility for 9 years without full knowledge of what moved through it. He thought about the political contacts on the list, some of whom had made genuinely corrupt choices for which they bore full responsibility, and some of whom had been maneuvered into relationships they hadn't entirely understood and couldn't exit cleanly once they did. Because the less I gave, Taejun said, the more of it stayed buried. And buried things don't stay buried, they just wait. Sungjin held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. Taejun got in the elevator. He drove himself to the Capitol Hill apartment and ate lunch and packed a small bag. 3 changes of clothes, the books he had been reading, the letter he would give Rowe in the morning, a photograph of himself and Soo-yeon taken at their parents' house in 1987 when he was 6 and she was 11, and neither of them knew anything about what was coming, and sat on Imani's couch in the apartment's particular quiet until evening. He called Cho at 7. Tomorrow, Cho said. Tomorrow. A silence. Cho's silences were always working silences, full of something being processed rather than empty. The restaurant, Cho said. I went in today, ate lunch. How was it? It was good. The cook they have for the tofu stew, she's been there 9 years. She knew the whole history. A pause. She didn't seem bothered. She just cooks. Taejun thought about that. A woman who had been cooking tofu stew in a restaurant for 9 years, through the various architectures of ownership above her, simply continuing to cook because the cooking was the work, and the work was what she was there for. Take care of that place, Taejun said. I intend to. They stayed on the phone for another minute without speaking. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 men who had shared 20 years of something enormous and were now, separately, beginning the process of understanding who they were without it. Cho, Taejun said. Yeah, the daughter, nursing school. She's good, second year. When she finishes, if she needs anything for the first year, equipment, licensing fees, whatever comes up, call Sung Jin. There's an account designated for that. A very long pause. You didn't have to do that, Cho said. I know, get some sleep. He hung up. The morning of the surrender was cold and clear, one of those November breaks in the Pacific Northwest, when the cloud system lifts unexpectedly and the sky goes hard blue and the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look more specific than usual. The edges of buildings sharp, the water visible in the distance with a clarity it doesn't often have. Taejun dressed carefully, not the way he had dressed for 20 years, not the armor of expensive tailoring deployed as authority, just carefully. A dark suit, clean, pressed. A tie he had owned for 12 years that Amani had given him, charcoal gray with an almost invisible pattern, which he had chosen this morning not from sentiment, but because it was a good tie and he owned it and it suited the occasion. He looked at himself in the mirror of the Capitol Hill apartment for a moment. He looked like a man who had been through something significant and was on the other side of it, which was accurate. He looked tired in a way that had settled into the structure of his face rather than sitting on the surface of it, which was also accurate. He looked, he thought, more like himself than he had in years, though the version of himself that was becoming visible was not one he had previously met. He gave Ro the letter in the lobby of the federal building. She took it without asking what it was. She had understood, from his prior instructions, that there was correspondence to be forwarded after Tuesday. She put it in her bag with the professional neutrality of someone who understands that certain things belong to her clients and not to her. They went in. The surrender process was procedural and unhurried, which was perhaps the most disorienting aspect of it. That the formal end of 20 years of criminal enterprise was managed through the same bureaucratic mechanisms as any other federal legal proceeding. Forms, signatures, the reading of conditions, the processing of personal property, the exchange of the surrendered passport, which the federal agent handling it received with the same expression he would have received a parking permit. Taejun answered every question directly and completely. He did not perform anything. When Walsh came through at 11:30 to confirm several details related to the Mincheol documentation, Taejun answered those questions with the same directness, and Walsh left without ceremony. Donovan appeared briefly at 12:15. She stood in the doorway of the processing room for a moment with a folder under her arm and looked at Taejun with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, something more complicated and less performed than either. The Mincheol operation, she said. The coordinated arrests are scheduled for Thursday. He nodded. The 3 shell entities you documented. They connected to 2 additional financial structures we hadn't mapped. The scope is larger than our original assessment. I suspected it might be. She held his gaze for a moment. You could have given us less, she said. The cooperation agreement would have been satisfied. I know. Why didn't you? He had answered this question once already today, for Sungjin. The answer was the same. Because less wasn't the truth, he said, and I'd spent enough of my life working with less than the truth. Donovan looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, a small, specific acknowledgement, and left. Ro touched his arm. Bail posted. You're processed. You have the check-in conditions. Yes. Surrendered passport confirmed. Geographic restrictions confirmed. She looked at her notes. You're clear to leave. He walked back out of the federal building at 12:47 in the afternoon. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the hard November light and breathed the cold air and looked at the street. People moved past him in both directions, purposeful and separate, each carrying the specific weight of their own Tuesday. A woman in a red coat was on the phone, laughing at something. A delivery worker pushed a hand truck around a corner. 2 young men in construction gear were eating sandwiches on a low concrete wall, their conversation inaudible from where Taejun stood. The city moved. It did not acknowledge him. It had no reason to. He walked 3 blocks to his car and sat in the driver's seat and did not start the engine for several minutes. He was not composing himself. He was already composed, or rather he had moved past the kind of composure that required effort and into something steadier, something that would need to be rebuilt from different materials than the ones he'd used for 20 years, but which was, in this moment, simply what he was. He thought about Imani, not the version of her he had constructed across 17 years of marriage, the version arranged around his needs, her reliability converted into his assumption, her presence converted into an ambient feature of his world rather than a person choosing, daily, to remain in it. The actual version. The woman who had stood at the foot of his dining room table and set down a wedding ring with the specific quietness of someone who had already, long before that moment, understood exactly what they were doing and why. The woman who had spent 15 years building, quietly and with extraordinary care, the structure required to survive the ending of a marriage to a man who had never, until the ending, understood that the ending was survivable only because of her preparation and not in spite of it. He started the car. He drove to Portland that afternoon, not because he had arranged it. Su-yeon didn't know he was coming, or knew only through the imprecise channels of sibling intuition, which in her case had always been considerably more accurate than he had acknowledged. He drove because the Capitol Hill apartment was Imani's, and the waterfront estate was gone, and there was, at this moment, no geographic location that was his in the simple and undisputed sense. And Portland was where Su-yeon was, and Su-yeon was, among the people remaining in his life, the person whose continued presence had nothing to do with his utility to her and everything to do with the fact that she was his sister and had decided, sometime in the last weeks, that this fact outweighed her grievances against who he had become. That was not a small thing. He pulled up outside her house at 6 in the evening. The porch light was on. It was always on after dark. She had kept it that way since their mother died, a habit she had never explained and which he had never asked about. He knocked. She opened the door, looked at him for a moment, then stepped back to let him in. "There's soup," she said. "Okay." She fed him. She did not ask about the day. She asked about the drive, which had been uneventful, and about whether he had eaten before Portland, which he hadn't, and she noted this with the specific expression she had deployed for 30 years in response to evidence that he was treating his body as an afterthought. After dinner, she poured 2 small glasses of something, a Korean rice wine she kept for occasions she didn't specify and he didn't ask about. And they sat in her living room, which was warm and slightly cluttered in the way of a room actually lived in, bookshelves with books that had been read, a plant on the windowsill that was thriving rather than decorative, a rug worn at the center from years of someone's feet. "Tuesday is done," Su-yeon said. "Tuesday is done." And the sentence, March, Rowe thinks the cooperation documentation strengthens the recommendation substantially. 4 years, approximately. She looked at her glass. "When we were growing up," she said, "and you used to take apart Mother's radio to see how it worked and then put it back together. You remember that?" He remembered. He had been 8. The radio had worked afterward, mostly. "You always knew how things were built," she said. "You always understood structure, how pieces connected to other pieces, how systems held together." She paused. "I used to think that was your gift. Now I think it was also the thing that—" She stopped, chose a different word. "Narrowed you." "Yes," he said, "because you understood systems, but you treated people like systems, and people aren't systems." "No." "Imani," she said. Not a question, just the name placed between them. "I wrote her a letter," he said. Su-yeon nodded slowly. "What did you say?" "The truth, not the arranged version, the actual thing." She looked at him. Her eyes, which were their mother's eyes and which he had not inherited, were doing something complicated. Not quite sad, not quite satisfied. Something in between that had the texture of a person watching someone arrive. Late, at a place they should have reached years ago. "She may not answer," Su-yeon said. "I know." "And if she doesn't?" He thought about that. "I thought about it honestly, not with the strategic distance of a man calculating acceptable outcomes, but with the actual weight of it, the reality of a version of the future in which Imani Caldwell read his letter and decided that it was insufficient, or too late, or that nothing he could put on paper could adequately bridge what the dining room had done. Then I will have said the true thing, he said, and she will have received it, and that will have to be enough. Because anything beyond that is asking her to do something for me, and she's done enough for me without being asked. Su-yeon was quiet for a moment. Stay the week, she said. He stayed 4 days. On Thursday, Seo Min-cheol was arrested at his residence in Mercer Island at 6:15 in the morning, simultaneously with coordinated federal operations in Tacoma, Spokane, Portland, and 3 locations in Vancouver, British Columbia. 11 people were taken in total. The Seattle News covered it with the compressed urgency of a story that had been building in the background of the regional news cycle for months, and was now, suddenly, the front. Taejin heard about it from Cho, who heard about it from a contact, who had heard about it from the particular information channels that survived the collapse of both organizations in the way that information channels always survive, quietly, through the habitual connectivity of people who have spent years knowing things before those things become official. He and Cho were on the phone for 4 minutes. "It's done," Cho said. "It's done," Taejun agreed. Neither man said anything else of substance. The collapse of Min Keol's operation was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was the logical conclusion of decisions made across years, by multiple people, for multiple reasons, some of which had been Taejun's decisions and some of which had not. It was simply the thing that happened after the thing that had already happened, connected to it by cause and by the specific gravity of accumulated consequence. "The restaurant," Cho said, as he had the night before Tuesday. "How is it?" "Good. I'm going to expand the lunch service. The neighborhood has changed enough that there's traffic we weren't capturing. Trust your read on the neighborhood." "I intend to." A pause. "Taejun, one thing." "Yes." "Lim's boy. The situation with his case. The protection framework Roe had negotiated included language covering coerced cooperators, people whose participation in the federal investigation had been secured through leverage against family members or through circumstances that fell short of genuine voluntary choice. Lim's name was in that language, and by extension, the federal case against his son had been addressed within the framework's provisions. "It's handled," Taejun said. "Roe confirmed it last week." "I know. He knows. Lim. He asked me to tell you." Taejun looked out the window of Soo-yeon's kitchen at the Portland morning, gray and soft, the particular gray of the Pacific Northwest in late autumn, that is not oppressive but simply present, like the weather has decided to be honest about what season it is. "Tell Lim to take care of his son," Taejun said. He returned to Seattle on Friday. The Capitol Hill apartment had, in the weeks he had spent there, developed a quality it had not possessed when he first arrived. It had become, tentatively and without any deliberate effort, a space he inhabited rather than occupied. He had rearranged nothing. He had changed nothing structural, but he had learned the acoustics of it, which pipes made which sounds in the morning, how the light moved through the south-facing windows from mid-afternoon into evening, the particular creak of the third floorboard from the bathroom door, which Imani had presumably known and which he had catalogued the way you catalog things in a space where you've decided to be present. He spent the weeks between Portland and the sentencing hearing in a rhythm that was, by any external measure, modest. Animad his weekly calls to Roe. He attended the required federal check-ins with the geographic compliance that the bail conditions mandated. He read. He cooked, badly at first, and then with improving competence, discovering in the process that cooking was a task that responded well to attention without requiring strategic brilliance, which made it, of the available activities, one of the more manageable for someone whose intelligence had spent decades in strategic overdrive and needed something to do that wasn't a war. He wrote to Cho. He wrote to Soo-yeon. He wrote once to Seung-jin, not about legal matters, but a short personal note thanking him for 14 years of professional counsel delivered with consistent integrity, which Seung-jin acknowledged with a reply that was professional in its brevity and genuine in its warmth, which was exactly the register Seung-jin occupied, and which Taejun had never previously noticed enough to value. Imani's letter arrived in the second week of December. He had not expected it, not this quickly. He had instructed Roe to forward his letter through Naomi Whittaker's office without any attached expectation or request for response, and he had spent the intervening weeks actively working against the habit of checking for a reply, which was itself a form of discipline requiring more effort than most of the operational decisions he had made in 20 years of running an organization. The envelope came through Roe's office. Roe texted him. Correspondence forwarded from Whittaker's office. "I'm sending it through courier. Should arrive this afternoon." He was in the kitchen when the knock came. He opened the envelope at the kitchen table, under the window, in the thin December afternoon light. 3 pages. Handwritten. Her script, the forward-leaning, precise hand he had seen on development notes and grocery lists, and the occasional reminder left on the kitchen counter of the waterfront estate, notes he had registered without reading fully because he had learned, somewhere in the middle years, to let the visual cue of her writing on paper serve as a proxy for attending to what the writing said. He read every word. She did not begin with pleasantries, and she did not begin with accusation. So began in the middle of something she had apparently been working through for some time, which was the honest accounting of their marriage as she had experienced it. Not the version designed for his consumption, not the version shaped by the anger that had been genuine and present, and which she acknowledged without making it the organizing principle of the letter. She wrote about the years that had been real. She named specific things. A weekend in Vancouver in their third year of marriage when they had walked for hours and talked about things that had nothing to do with business or obligation. A period in the seventh year when her father's health had first begun declining, and Taejun had, without being asked and without announcement, restructured his schedule for 3 months to ensure she was not navigating her father's illness alone. She wrote, "You did that without asking for credit for it. I don't think you even understood, at the time, that you were doing something significant. You just did it. That was the version of you that I built my idea of our marriage around. I spent the next 10 years waiting for that version to come back." She wrote about her father's assessment of Taejun, which matched his own reconstruction of it so precisely that he understood, reading it, that Malcolm Caldwell had apparently said the same things to both of them. To Taejun once, obliquely, at the beginning, and to Imani more directly, over years, in the way that parents communicate the things they're most afraid of to the children they love most. She wrote, "He told me once, about 3 years into our marriage, that the most dangerous man was not the man who intended to destroy you, but the man who believed so completely in his own structure that he never noticed what the structure was costing the people inside it. He said he hoped he was wrong about you. He wasn't angry when he said it. He just meant it." She wrote about the Caldwell trust structure and about the years of maintaining it, the specific daily work of keeping her financial and professional life genuinely separate from his, which had required not just legal architecture but a continuous, deliberate commitment to her own separateness that had been, she acknowledged, isolating in ways she had not fully understood until it was no longer necessary. She wrote, "Keeping that separation meant I could never be fully in. You always read that as self-sufficiency, which it was, but it was also loneliness. I was protecting myself from you, inside our marriage, for 15 years. That is not a sentence I expected to be able to write without rage. I find that I can write it now with something closer to grief, which feels like progress." She wrote about forgiveness, honestly and without the comfort of false resolution. "I don't forgive you yet. I've said that clearly, and I mean it clearly. But I want you to understand what that means and what it doesn't mean, because I think you've spent enough of your life operating on false certainties, and you deserve a real one. It means that I am still doing the work of arriving at a place where what you did is something I can set down and move forward without carrying. It does not mean I have decided you are unredeemable, or that the letter you wrote was insufficient, or that who you are now, as opposed to who you were in that dining room, is something I've dismissed. I received your accounting. I recognize the person writing it. That matters." She wrote about the Tacoma waterfront project. She described it in detail. The scope of it, the technical and political complexity, the specific quality of the industrial remediation required before construction could begin. She wrote 3 paragraphs about a project he had no direct knowledge of and no connection to. And then she wrote, "I'm telling you about this because I want you to understand what I'm doing now, not as an update that requires a response, but because I think the person who wrote that letter is someone who would actually want to know. I was the woman standing beside you at galas for 17 years. This is the woman I am when I'm standing where I actually belong." She ended, "When you come out of there, not if when. I hope you find the version of yourself that showed up for 3 months during my father's illness and built something with it. Not for me, for yourself. Because I think that person existed and got buried, and it would be a different kind of waste than the financial kind if he stayed buried. I won't be waiting. That is simply the truth, and you already know it. But I am no longer only angry, and I wanted you to know that too, because you told me the truth in your letter, and you deserved the same in return." Imani Caldwell. He read it 3 times. Then he sat with it in both hands at Imani's kitchen table for a long time, the December light doing its minimal work through the south-facing window, moving almost imperceptibly as the afternoon progressed, and the angle of the light shifted by degrees. He was not trying to process it strategically. I was not identifying what it meant for his timeline or his situation or any category of consideration external to simply what it was, which was a woman who had been wronged comprehensively and across many years telling him, with the specific honesty of someone who has done the work of arriving at honesty rather than simply declaring it, exactly where she was. She was not waiting. That was the true and complete and not unkind fact of it. I understood it as such, without the habitual reach toward some alternative calculation. She was not waiting, and she had said so directly and without cruelty, and what that asked of him was to receive it honestly, rather than converting it into something more useful to his own needs. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the book on the table. Not the one he had been reading, but a different book. One Su Yan had given him when he left Portland, a collection of essays she had carried around for years, with the specific recommendation that some of them might be worth his time. He had not yet opened it. He placed Amani's letter inside the cover. He wrote back 3 days later. He did not rush it, and he did not labor over it. He wrote 1 page. He acknowledged everything she had said with the directness it deserved, not as a man who was still constructing an argument or managing an impression, but as a man who had been given honesty and was capable, perhaps for the first time in their shared history, of simply receiving it and returning it. He wrote, "The 3 months during your father's illness. I remember them. I remember deciding to restructure the schedule and thinking it was a simple logistical adjustment. I did not understand until I read your letter that it was perhaps the only period in our marriage when I was doing something without any calculation of what it built for me. Just doing the thing because it was the right thing. I have spent the last weeks trying to understand why I couldn't sustain that. The most honest answer I have arrived at is that I had constructed an identity so completely around building and acquiring that the moments when I just showed up as a person, without the architecture, without the projection, frightened me in a way I never admitted and barely acknowledged. It was easier to build more than to stay still and be someone." He wrote, "You said you were no longer only angry. That is enough. You don't owe me more than that, and I'm not asking for it. I wanted you to know that what you've described, the Tacoma waterfront, the work you're doing, who you are when you're standing where you actually belong, it is exactly what I always understood you were capable of, and failed, consistently, to honor in proportion to what it deserved." He ended, "Take care of the Tacoma project. Take care of yourself. I'll take care of whatever comes next from here." He signed it simply, Tai Jun. He sent it through Ro's office. Whether she wrote back was not something he organized his days around. The sentencing hearing arrived on a Thursday in March, cold and bright, the kind of late winter morning that has decided to be cooperative without quite committing to spring. Taejun dressed in the same dark suit as the surrender, same tie. He had worn it once between then and now, to a dinner at Su Yan's house in February, and she had looked at it and said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. He stood outside the federal courthouse for 2 minutes before going in. He breathed the cold air. He looked at the light on the street. He thought about 20 years, not with the weight of regret that collapses into paralysis, but with the specific, clear-eyed weight of a man who has done the full accounting and knows both what was built and what it cost. He had built something. He had built it wrong. I was going to have a time now, son. Not the time he would have chosen, not the kind that arrives with options and open geography, but time nonetheless, to begin understanding what building right might actually require. He went inside. The judge read the cooperation documentation with the same thorough attention Ro had predicted. Walsh presented the prosecution's recommendation with the formal precision of federal procedure. Ro delivered the defense's framework with the quiet competence that had characterized everything she had done for him since she walked into his situation in October. The judge asked Taejun if he wanted to speak. He stood. He did not use the prepared remarks, or most of them. He said that he had spent 20 years building an organization by treating everything in it, including the people, as structural components rather than as human beings with their own accounts of what the experience had cost them. He said that the cooperation he had provided was not strategic calculation in excess of what was legally required, but was the first time in his adult life that he had committed to telling the complete truth about something, regardless of what the complete truth cost him personally. He said he understood this was a late arrival at a standard that should not require an indictment to produce, and he was not offering it as mitigation, but as a plain statement of fact about where he was. He said one more thing, which was not in the prepared remarks, and which he had not planned to say. He said, The woman I was married to spent 17 years maintaining an integrity I never matched and a loyalty I never deserved. The dissolution of that marriage was not a casualty of the legal proceedings. It was a consequence of choices I made long before any federal investigation existed. I want that on the record not because it affects the sentence, but because accuracy matters, and she deserves to have the record accurate. He sat down. Rose's expression did not change, but the hand she placed on his arm briefly was fractionally warmer than the professional gesture of Tuesday. The judge sentenced him to 5 years, minimum security, with credit for voluntary surrender and the comprehensive nature of cooperation reducing effective time to 4 years and 3 months. Mandatory financial compliance monitoring for 7 years post-release. He was remanded to begin the sentence within 30 days, with bail continuing on existing conditions in the interim. He walked out into the March morning. Su Yeon was on the sidewalk. He had told her not to come. She had come anyway, in the absolute and final way that older sisters exercise specific authority over brothers who have been trying to manage everything alone for too long. She looked at him. She did not ask about the sentence. She already knew from Rose's office, which she had apparently been in contact with through channels he had not fully tracked, which was, he thought, something he should not have been surprised by. "Come to Portland for the 30 days, she said. He almost said he would think about it. "Yes," he said instead. He spent the 30 days in Portland. He helped Su Yeon assemble a bookshelf, which took longer than either of them expected, and produced a conversation about following instructions that was probably about more than the bookshelf. He cooked dinner 3 times, with improving results. He walked along the waterfront in the mornings when the weather allowed, long and unhurried walks that had no destination and no purpose except forward motion in the fresh air, which turned out to be sufficient purpose for the available time. He read Soo-yeon's book of essays. One of them, by a writer he had not previously encountered, argued that the primary human work is not construction, but attention, that what distinguishes a life from a mere sequence of events is the quality of presence brought to each moment, the willingness to actually look at what is there rather than at the projection of what you need it to be. He read that essay twice. He entered the federal minimum security facility in Oregon on a Tuesday morning in April, accompanied to the entrance by Soo-yeon, who hugged him once, brief and firm, no theater, and said, "Call when you can," and turned and walked back to her car without looking back, which was the right thing to do and which he understood as such. The facility was what it was: structured, modest, populated by men managing their own accountings with varying degrees of engagement. Taejun adapted to it in the way that someone adapts. When the alternative to adaptation is simply more suffering than the situation requires. He worked in the library 2 mornings a week. He made his Sunday calls to Soo-yeon. He wrote letters to Cho, who wrote back with the terse, practical warmth that had always characterized Cho's communication, and which Taejun now understood, reading it in the context of a facility common room rather than an operational office, as one of the more genuinely sustaining things in his life. Cho's letters reported on the restaurant in the International District with the straightforward precision of someone who had found, in the work of managing a small and legitimate business, a version of organizational life that suited him more than he had anticipated. The lunch service expansion was performing well. The cook with the tofu stew had been given a raise, which was, in the letter's exact words, overdue by approximately 4 years. Taejun read that and thought about the cook who had been cooking for 9 years through the various architectures of ownership above her, simply doing the work because the work was what she was there for. He thought about that a lot in the months that followed. Imani's second letter arrived in July. He had not expected it, and its arrival was therefore the kind of surprise that arrives as its own complete thing, without the contamination of anticipation. She wrote about the Tacoma waterfront project, which was progressing. She wrote about a new project in Renton she was evaluating. She wrote about her mother, who was 71 and sharp, and had said nothing directly about any of it, but whose presence at twice-weekly breakfasts was, she wrote, one of the steadier things in her life. She wrote, "I painted the kitchen wall of the Capitol Hill apartment in January. A blue-green I'd wanted for 2 years. It looks exactly right. I don't know why I'm telling you that, except that it seemed like something you would want to know, now, even though knowing it changes nothing practical. Maybe that's why it's worth telling, because it doesn't have to change anything to be worth saying." She wrote, "I read your second letter, the part about the 3 months during my father's illness, about being frightened by the moments when you were just a person without the architecture. I have thought about that a lot. I think you may have identified the true thing, which is different from the useful thing or the defensible thing. I think the version of you that existed in those 3 months was the version you didn't know how to protect. So you built more architecture around him until he disappeared. She ended, I'm not angry today. I want you to know that. It comes and goes still. The anger, the grief, the more complicated things that don't have single names. But today I am not angry. I am working. The Tacoma waterfront will be finished in 18 months, and it is going to be exactly what I wanted it to be. That is enough for today. Imani. He read it in the library on a Tuesday morning with the institution's ordinary sounds around him. Someone's chair scraping the floor, a distant conversation in the corridor, the particular ambient noise of a building housing people who are managing time. He held the letter in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She was not waiting. She had said so, and it was true, and it remained true, and the letter did not change it, and he did not ask it to. But she was not only angry, and she had told him about the blue-green wall. He folded the letter. He placed it with the first one, inside the cover of Su Yan's book of essays, which he kept on the shelf above his bunk with the photograph of himself and his sister at their parents' house in 1987. He would write back on Thursday. He would tell her that the Tacoma waterfront being exactly what she wanted it to be was not a small thing, and that he understood it was not a small thing, and that he was glad. Outside the facility's narrow windows, the Oregon summer was proceeding in its particular fashion, the dry gold light of July moving across the hills in long afternoon angles, the landscape doing the unhurried work of a season that has no appointments and no urgency and no particular interest in whether the people watching it are ready for it. Taejin Kong sat in a library in a minimum security federal facility with his sister's book in his hands and his estranged wife's letters inside the cover. And he breathed, and he was present, and he attended to the fact of his own existence without reaching, for the first time in as long as he could accurately remember, for the next thing to build. He was learning what it felt like to simply be still. It was harder than building an empire. He kept at it,